So finding good value out of a 3D printer is really difficult. You often have to spend a lot of time and a lot of money upgrading them and tinkering with them to get them exactly where they need to be. This is something that I've battled for the past year with my Ender 3 V2s. But with the SideWinder X2, you don't have to tinker with it. It's already ready to go straight out of the box, easy to assemble, and you can get up and printing within about 10 minutes of time. Today, we're going to be reviewing that printer. Let's get started. What's going on, everybody? Ken here, you're watching OriginaldoBo. Today, we're going to be reviewing and talking about the SideWinder X2 from Artillery. This is a brand new printer that I've been using for the past 2 weeks. I was looking for something that was going to provide me with a little bit larger build volume and a lot less fuss. After doing some research, watching several videos, I landed on the SideWinder X2. Now, this printer comes in at roughly $399 US. And I think it's the best bang for buck value when it comes to 3D printing. So let's go ahead and just jump into this review by talking about the build quality. Now, the SideWinder X2 has a mostly all metal build design with the exception of that top rail that is injection molded plastic. We'll touch more on that here in just a second. The power supply is all internal in the base of this 3D printer, and it has a very large build volume at 300 millimeters by 300 millimeters by 400 millimeters, which absolutely dwarfs my Ender 3 Pro and my Mini Prusa. The direct drive on this printer is also a welcome addition. It's really hard to find printers that come with the direct drive. A lot of the reason behind me choosing something that is direct drive versus Bowden tube is I find myself printing a lot more of the softer TPU materials, especially since a lot of what I do 3D printing for has to do with FPV and drones, and we need sort of that impact resistant material. So it's nice to have direct drive. It does make printing an absolute joy. It does sport 2 dual Z-axis motors, which makes sense because it is direct drive. You typically have a lot more fatigue on that X carriage. The X carriage is the vertical axis of the 3D printer. So it's going to help reduce that fatigue in lifting the Z up and down. My Ender 3 V2s, I have direct drive on those, albeit not Titan direct drives. It does cause some ghosting at times and does cause some issues by not having dual Z-axis. Of course, you can upgrade it to a dual Z-axis, but then you're just going to add on to the price, and this already comes with it for the $399. Overall, I think the build quality is fantastic. It also sports a touchscreen at the front. The touchscreen is small. I think that it could definitely have used a bigger touchscreen, especially with the weird UI. And we're going to touch more on the UI of this printer here in a little bit, but I do find that the touchscreen is a little bit cramped, but I mean, it's not terrible. It is sensitive and it does work. It gets the job done, but it is just a little peculiar. Now, the build plate on this printer does not remove. So a lot of these printers, they have removable plates where you can take them off and put a different style, like a textured plate into place. But this does have a glass build plate and it is non-removable. So one of the nice things though, is they do have a touch probe. So it does measure the build plate. And it does do an auto leveling, and you can save that auto level so you don't have to do it each time. In my experience, I do find that works pretty well actually. So that is a cool thing that it does have auto leveling built into this machine. You can use SD cards and you can also use USB thumb drives. I'm using a USB thumb drive. I find that the thumb drives are just easier for my workflow, but that's how you can go ahead and transfer files from the printer over to your computer or from the computer to the printer. So all of that works really, really well. All right, let's talk about the assembly of this printer because I think this is going to be a big attraction for people who are just starting out in 3D printing and they don't want to, have to do a lot of assembly. So when I first bought my first printer, it took me about an hour to put that printer together. It was an Ender 3 Pro, and it took a while to put together and calibrate and make sure it was printing correctly. But with the SideWinder X2, much like my Prusa Mini, it took me about 10 minutes to assemble this, and it was pretty much good to go. In about 15 minutes time, I was up and printing and able to do a test calibration, just that easy. So the printer comes in the box 95% complete. The only thing you have to do is install the Z-axis onto the printer, and it slides down into these notches, and then simply screw in the 4 screws that are already pre-installed in the base of the printer underneath. After that, you just plug in your Z-axis motors, set up your filament runout sensor, and you are done. You can go on to calibrating the printer. Now, they do include some pink filament with this printer, and it's a pretty good amount of filament. So if you didn't have any filament, you could print a couple of things with that roll that they do include, which I thought was a nice touch. I did my calibration print, and I thought it came out perfect, like absolutely flawless straight out of the gate. The profile that I am using for the X2 is the X1 profile, because not a lot has really changed between the X1 and X2. Most of what they have changed really comes in terms of just improvements to the cabling. And we'll touch more on that here in a little bit when I start talking about the things I don't like about this printer. All right, let's move on to talk about that direct drive. So why direct drive? Well, if you're printing a lot of these softer TPU materials, oftentimes with Bowden tubes, you will get jams in the printer. And me printing FPV parts, I need to know that I'm able to print things jam-free and to make sure I can get the best possible print quality, especially since I'm selling a lot of these components. And what I found is that this Titan direct drive does an amazing job, required zero fuss, and my TPU prints came out very, very nice. I mean, they look amazing. I didn't notice any sort of like nippling on the prints. That's where you get these little burrs on the side. I didn't notice any stringing, which is also a thing that can happen with those softer materials. I mean, all of the prints just looked absolutely flawless. So safe to say, I'm pretty happy with this Titan direct drive. It also has that front mount fan, which keeps the prints cool. It just works amazing. The other thing I want to add note to is how quiet this printer is. When it's turned on, which it's on right now, you hear nothing. There is no fans running right now, which is great. It's completely silent when it's completed its printing process. But even when it's printing, it is pretty much the quietest printer in this office right now, which is awesome. That means I can still continue to film videos or go about my business and don't have to worry about this loud sound of a printer. It does have a 32-bit motherboard on board on this, which does make for some improvements. Artillery's really tried to fine tune it, and it definitely shows. All the steppers are completely silent, which is pretty awesome. All right, let's talk about the touch interface and the UI, because the UI is just, the most confusing UI. It's easy to navigate if you have been 3D printing for a little bit, because you can understand things, but there's like all these weird submenus on this printer that just don't really make sense. And it's all cramped in this very small touchscreen, which I don't really like. To try to find a way to do the calibration for the leveling, you have to dig under tools, go under more, basically level out each axis, which doesn't make much sense. And then you can also adjust your Z-axis, which this is the most frustrating thing about this printer, is on the Z-axis, it shows 0.0025 on the Z-axis. And if you tap it, it doesn't actually show you where your live Z-axis is right now. So there is no live Z-axis. You just tap it. And if you listen, the stepper is moving. But unless you're putting a piece of paper underneath there to physically feel how far that stepper is moving, you're not going to ever actually know how far it's moving. So keep that in mind. Luckily for me, I really didn't have to do that. I was able to use the build plate to sort of help level out this printer. But keep in mind that the live Z-axis doesn't actually show it doesn't show the offset at all. So you have to use a piece of paper to go all 4 corners to make sure everything is leveled before printing. It doesn't take long to do, but it is a frustrating thing, and I would love Artillery to update that in a future firmware. And maybe on the next version of this printer, give us a bigger touchscreen where the menu isn't all that cramped. Because when you start looking through your models on the touchscreen, they're quite truncated. So what I found myself doing is, as I'm exporting the files, truncating the name of the file just a little bit more. It does go in a time order, so your newest print is going to be all the way to the end, and your oldest print will be all the way at the beginning of the files on the SD card or your USB thumb drive. So that is a good thing that at least you can understand where things are. All right, how do the prints actually look? Well, they look pretty good. Now, I took the approach of I don't do benchmarks because I'm never going to print a benchmark. I don't care about these benchmarks. How well they print FPV mounts, how well they print the battery covers and the GoPro mounts that I'm actually selling on my Etsy store. So what I went ahead and did was printed several of my 3D prints with this printer that I would typically sell just to see how they did. And I have to say, I'm really impressed with the quality. The only benchmark that I did was that first calibration print, which sort of left me blown away. And then from that point, I went ahead and printed some of my battery covers along with some of the FPV mounts that go on the DJI FPV drone. Now, the battery covers are probably the most taxing thing that I do print. It's also the one that I have the most amount of issues with, just simply because of how they have to print. I started out by printing one cover, and the cover came out pretty good. And then I went on to printing 3 at a time. Now, when I started printing 3 at a time, I noticed that there was a good amount of ghosting in the print, which may be something I have to work on as far as my profile. If I compare it to what I'm getting off of my Ender, they're pretty similar in quality as far as the prints go. But one thing to remember is I've had about 8 months to fine tune that profile that I'm using on my Ender. I haven't had any time to fine tune this right off the SideWinder. So it's going to take some time for me to fine tune that profile, but I think the print was definitely acceptable and it was certainly sellable. Moving over to FPV mounts for the Apex frame, I feel like these mounts came out exceptional. I've always had problems with this filament from SaintSmart. This is their Neon Punk Turquoise, which it's a very soft material. And anytime I've tried to print this on the Ender printers, I've always got prints that were just way too soft to use for FPV. But what I found with utilizing a 30% infill on the SideWinder, the print came out perfect. It feels great. It's probably the best that this filament has ever printed, and there's no ghosting or any burrs or any real imperfections that I can see within this print. Moving on to my FPV helmets, these are made out of PLA. I think these look great. They're really, really detailed, and I printed them at a 0.2 millimeter layer height, and I think they just look amazing. I did have to put down a little bit of glue on the build plate, and that's not really just exclusive to the SideWinder. That is just in general. These prints take time to print, and sometimes they do peel even on my Ender and even on my Prusa. So putting down a little bit of glue on the build plate, just make sure that first layer really sticks and I get good adhesion. But I think that these came out pretty fantastic. And then the last thing that I printed was my slick stick mounts for the Autel Evo Lite and the Nano series. And this one is a little bit difficult. I must have tried this about 3 or 4 times and it kept slipping off the build plate. And I can only just imagine, just because of how these are, once you get to the higher end of the build, it does teeter a little bit. And I think my Z-axis was dropped down a little bit too low, and it was causing it to put pressure and peel it off the build plate. By the 3rd time of me trying to print it, I finally got good adhesion. I finally got my Z-axis right where I needed it to be, and it was printing just fine. And I think it looks incredibly detailed. And for me, this is perfect because I would actually really use this and I would really sell it. All right, so what's my conclusion of the SideWinder X2? I think it's a great printer if you are somebody who is into FPV and you are printing a lot of soft materials. It does PLA just fine, but I think that this really excels with softer TPU materials. You can print at higher speeds from what I've noticed. I was printing my TPU at 55 on the speed, which usually people will drop the speeds down to like 45 when it comes to TPU, but I was able to achieve a little bit faster speeds without really reducing the quality of the print. I think if you really factor in the fact that in order to take an Ender 3 V2 to this level here, you're going to be at about $450 after you've added everything into place. Not only that, the time it takes to assemble and then calibrate it, you can just get one of these for $399 and basically be ready to go in 10 minutes right out of the box. Now, some of the things that I don't like about this printer is the way the direct drive is set up. It does make doing any sort of maintenance a little bit more difficult. And the fact that if any of these ribbon cables come loose, it could cause potential problems with the print. But SideWinder X2 does have retention clips that fixes the problems from the SideWinder X1 when it comes to these ribbon cables. So these ribbon cables used to not have retention clips on the X1 series, and they would periodically come loose, causing the printer to stop in its tracks. So that's something to think about, but nothing that I feel is really going to be a problem with this printer now. I think Artillery really went through and improved things in the right places. But like I said, best bang for buck value if you have the room for it, because it is a pretty big printer. So it's just whether or not you have the room for something like this. But if you do, it's the quietest printer I have here. Been so far the most consistent so far. All right, that's gonna do it for this video. If you enjoyed, be sure to click that link down in the description below. You can pick up one of these from yourself from geekbuying.com. That is an affiliate link. I do get a minor kickback if you do purchase a printer from them. But yeah, there you go. Hopefully we'll be able to do more reviews just like this, because like I said, I really like doing 3D printing. I'll see you in the next video, and as always, stay original.
They checking for me, no one checking on me, so I had to go run up a check. I got the message on me, ain't no flexing on me. My attorney gon' call and collect. Blessings on blessings for me, my successes only made them envious, they got upset. I had to put all their egos in check. I want the money to